What we thought we would do today, and I realize this is very countercultural because you're used to seeing PowerPoint slides, but as a professor of public finance and as economists, we actually are going to just kind of lay it out in words. Some of the problems with the slides is that the numbers are so huge they don't even fit on the slides. But I'd like to start by simply laying out the scale of the war. On March 19th, we begin the 6th year of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And this is now the second longest military conflict in U.S. history after Vietnam. It's longer than World War I, longer than World War II, longer than our involvement in Korea, longer than the Civil War. To date, 1.65 million U.S. troops have been deployed. More than a third of them have served for 2, 3, or 4 tours of duty, and a tour of duty is 15 months. So many of our troops have been out in Iraq and Afghanistan for 30, 40 months. Of those, nearly 4,000 of our servicemen and women have been killed in Iraq, another 500 in Afghanistan, and there have been about 70,000 who have been wounded in action, injured, or who have contracted serious enough diseases to require medical evacuation from the field. Now, this is a very important number because the official data from the Pentagon, if you go onto the DoD website, for example, will show you a much smaller number. They will show you the 4,000 killed, which includes both hostile and non-hostile fatalities. But they will only show you the wounded in combat, which means, for example, that your Humvee took a direct hit from an explosive device. They don't show you the what is called the non-combat injuries, which would be, for example, if your Humvee is the second in the convoy that crashes into the truck, which is hit by the IED. And in order to get that additional list, which takes you up to the 70,000, you have to use the Freedom of Information Act to find the second sort of hard-to-find website, which publishes that full record. The kind of injuries which many of you are familiar with included a very high rate of blindness, deafness, traumatic brain injuries, burns, skin diseases, and amputation, and many troops returning with multiple conditions, which they call polytrauma. Of the 750,000 troops who have been discharged so far, of these, already 1/3 have been treated at veterans' hospitals and clinics for a variety of medical conditions, including 100,000 treated for mental health conditions, with more than 52,000 diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And the Department of Veterans Affairs, which is completely overwhelmed by this demand from returning veterans, expects to treat 333,000 returning Iraq and Afghan veterans at its hospitals and clinics this year. Most of these disabled veterans are also entitled to receive disability compensation. Already 228,000 have applied for such compensation, of which 90% have been approved. All of this kind of lays the groundwork for understanding the huge financial cost. And the war has cost about $600 billion to date. That's $600 billion to date. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is the cash cost of combat operations. Most of that money does not actually go to the troops. Only 10 to 15% actually goes to the troops, but it includes transportation, includes the very high cost of medical care on the front lines, repairing equipment, the very high price of fuel, and of course the very high cost of paying the more than 100,000 contractors who we are employing to do a wide range of activities, including repairing equipment, refueling, transporting, driving trucks, and so forth. And also the money that we spend to pay the reservists in National Guards, who are very expensive to deploy because ordinarily they would only be paid for one weekend a month if they were at home, but they are now paid a full-time salary plus combat pay. Now, there are four major costs when we talk about that $600 billion that are ignored in that figure. And it's important to note that if you are in private business, you have to report all of your costs. In other words, if you have accrued liabilities, money that, if you purchase a photocopier and you still owe money for the photocopier or a vehicle or whatever, you have to report all the money that you still owe. But the way the federal government does its accounting, they don't actually report the money that they still owe. And there are four sort of major categories of money that we still owe. The first is there is a war spending that is sort of hidden in the defense budget, in the regular defense budget. The regular defense budget has increased by a cumulative $500 billion since the beginning of the war, and this includes things like recruitment bonuses and reenlistment bonuses and increased pay on advertising. And secondly, and probably of most interest to all of you, there are the long-term costs that we are going to have to pay even if we withdraw tomorrow, primarily the extremely high cost of providing medical care to veterans, providing disability compensation to veterans, replacing military equipment, and restoring the armed forces to their pre-war strength. And the cost of caring for our veterans is much higher than in previous wars because the survival rate is much, much higher. And thanks to enormous advances in battlefield medicine, and I think many of you are aware of the remarkable speed with which even very serious brain injuries are packed in the field and evacuated to Langstroth in Germany. There are now 7 troops wounded in combat for every fatality, and if you include the non-hostile injuries, there are 15 troops wounded or injured for every fatality. And this is much, much higher than in previous wars. In Vietnam and Korea, it was fewer than 3 to 1. And this is a tribute to battlefield medicine, but it also significantly increases the cost. The disability benefits that we pay are a cost that goes on for a long time. We currently pay over $4 billion a year in disability benefits to veterans of the first Gulf War from 1991, even though that war only lasted for 1 month. We pay $16 billion in disability benefits to Vietnam veterans, and the cost keeps climbing. And this is a cost that goes on for decades. I was surprised to learn that we were still paying disability benefits for the Spanish-American War more than 60 years after it ended. Even though we've been very conservative in our estimates, we have sort of used the first Gulf War to project how many current veterans will require disability benefits. And we expect that at least the same number as in the first Gulf War, 44% of the current veterans will require this. In the interest of time, I won't say much about the military replenishment except to say that a recent survey of the 3,000 most senior military officials showed that 88% said that our forces are under significant strain. 2/3 of the senior military officers said that we are now weaker militarily than we were 5 years ago. And there are a very wide range of costs associated with getting both our equipment arsenal and our personnel back to pre-war strength. The third main cost we have ignored so far is the cost of paying interest on all the money that we've borrowed so far, which is all of it. And then there is the fourth cost, which is the cost of continuing combat operations. We are now spending $12 billion a month in Iraq alone, and that's just the cash cost, not including the veterans and the replenishing the military equipment. If If you add that, it's $25 billion a month going forward. And I think I don't need to tell this group the enormous impact that this has had on funding for the NIH, for children's health, for the Centers for Disease Control, for infrastructure, and for many, many areas of research which are important for this country. This all brings us to a total of close to $3 trillion, but this does not include the social and economic costs, and I'm going to hand you over to Joe Stiglitz to discuss how all this affects our economy.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about this issue. I can just talk from here. Now, the costs that Linda talked about are the budgetary costs. And what I want to talk about are the costs that go beyond the budget. A war like this war affects the economy, our society, in many different ways. And we divide those costs into two categories, the microeconomic costs and the macroeconomic costs. The microeconomic costs are the cost to individuals, their families, firms in the U.S. economy. Let me just give you an example. If a soldier is killed, his family will get $500,000 in what is called a death gratuity and life insurance. But if that individual had been killed in a senseless automobile accident, he almost surely would have gotten a lot more than that. When the government goes to evaluate a safety regulation, environmental regulation, it assesses the cost of the regulation, what it costs to implement the regulation, but it also looks at the benefit, and it looks at the benefit in terms of the number of lives saved. And then it tries to evaluate what a life is worth. And that's a very unpleasant topic, but resources are limited, and you have to, you can't have, you have to look at what each environmental regulation costs. The Bush administration is very strong about this, versus the value of the lives saved. And there's a standard methodology that's used all the time. It's called the Value of Statistical Life, VSL. And it's partly what these people would have produced had they been working. It's their opportunity cost. It's also related to, you can estimate how much extra people demand in compensation to work in occupations where there's a higher probability of death. And so you can make an inference of the value of life through these kinds of procedures. And they're totally standard in all areas where things are not very big. But when it comes to war, we've avoided doing anything like this. Well, the value of a statistical life that government agencies use, and this is also used in litigation, is between $7 million and more, $8, $9, $10 million. The number we use in our study is $7.2 million. Now that same kind of reasoning also applies to disabilities. The disability payments that the government pays is a fraction of what the loss of the productivity of the individual, and doesn't include the cost of caring for the individual. In 1 out of 5 families where there's a serious disability, somebody has to give up a job to care for them. And a lot of these disabilities are so severe that the person needs full-time care. So the budgetary cost is $500,000. The value of statistical life is more than 10 times that. The disability payments are significant, but they just capture a fraction of the cost to our society of taking care of these people and the lost productivity. So going beyond the budgetary cost, we try to calculate these economic impacts on the individuals, on their families. It really doesn't capture the total impact, but it's the part that we can capture. The other part is the macroeconomic cost. In this election, there's a lot of discussion about the economy replacing the war as the big issue. And what we try to argue, in fact, is that there's really only one issue, and that's the war, because the war is the primary factor underlying the weaknesses in the American economy. And I want to try to spend just a minute trying to explain the linkage between the two. And there are three reasons why this war has been particularly bad for the economy. Before that, I should mention that a lot of people have this mistaken notion that wars are good for the economy, and that's a notion that grew out of World War II. Before World War II was the Great Depression. The Great Depression is thought to have helped U.S. get out of and the world get out of the Great Depression. But at least since the time of Keynes, we know that we can stimulate the economy in ways that are constructive rather than destructive, that lead to long-run productivity increases, and you don't need a war to get out of a recession or depression. We know how to stimulate the economy. So the notion that wars are good for the economy is really rejected, I think, by all economists. And in fact, the 1991, the first Gulf War is actually, in many people's mind, related to the recession that the U.S. went into right after we went to war. Well, this war is particularly bad for the economy for three reasons, and two of them are really distinctive to this war. The first is that the war has led to an increase in the price of oil. Some people said it was a war to get for us oil. If that was the case, it was a disaster. It was a disaster on many other grounds, but in fact, at the time we went to war, the price was $25 a barrel. It's now over $100 a barrel. As we went to war, there are futures markets. Futures markets are markets where people are trying to look at the future, bet on what the price of oil is going to be 5, 10, 15 years from now. They look at supply factors and demand factors. They knew that there was increasing demand from China, India, and emerging markets, but they anticipated that supply would respond because the low-cost provider of oil in the world is the Middle East. The price of production in the Middle East is about $5 or less per barrel. And so the futures markets, as we went to war, thought the price of oil would remain at $25 a barrel for the next 10 years or more. Well, the one thing that changed that equation was the war. And the supply has not kept up with the demand, and the price has soared. It's a complicated story about exactly how it is interfered, but you can, the link is absolutely clear. Because we didn't want to get into a quibble with the few people who still support the war, in our estimates, we only used $5 to $10 of the $75 increase in the price of oil as attributable to the war. So when we say the cost of the war is $3 to $5 trillion, the true number is much larger than that. That's a conservative estimate based on only $5 to $10 of the increase in the price of oil. Now, you can see why increase in the price of oil is so bad for the economy. Money that would have been spent to help the American economy, spend it here at home, is being set. Checks of hundreds of billions of dollars are going over to Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the other oil exporters. And, the irony is that it has enriched some of the people that the U.S. is least interested in enriching, like Iran, Venezuela, all these people that many of whom we have been very critical of, the oil exporters, the dictatorships, have been one among the major beneficiaries of the war. The second reason this war is bad for the economy is that money spent in Iraq doesn't stimulate the economy in the way that money spent here would. If you're spending money on, say, a Nepalese or a Filipino contractor working in Iraq, it doesn't help the American economy, either now or in the future, in the same way that the same amount of money spent promoting research, building a road, or the hundreds of other things that we need here in the United States. It doesn't help us in the short run. It doesn't help us in the long run. And the third reason relates to a very distinctive aspect of this war. At the time we went to war, we already had a very large deficit. In the case of every other war in American history, as we went to war, there was a national discussion of how much of the cost of the war to be borne by this generation and how much to be passed on to future generations. In every other war, the decision was made that a significant fraction of the cost of the war would be borne by the generation, that there would be shared sacrifice, that you're asking your young men and women to go fight a war, and that those who are staying at home ought to bear some cost as part of a community, a shared community that is involved in the war. This is the first time in American history, maybe in the history of any country, where as you go to war, you actually cut taxes. The shared sacrifice was we asked people to go to the shopping mall. We cut taxes for upper income Americans. And the result of this is that this war is entirely financed by deficit. And so the entire cost is being passed on to future generations. And it was deliberate, as a deliberate attempt to keep away from the American people knowledge about what this war was costing. It's the same kind of thing that Linda was talking about. Just like they didn't want Americans to know how many people were being injured and made it difficult for us to find this out, they refused to come and testify to Congress about what their view of what the true costs of the war are. They've tried to hide, make the American people feel like this is a war for free. But just like there's no free lunches, it's a basic notion in economics, no such thing as a free lunch, except here. There is no such thing as a free war. Another very unusual thing about this war is that because Americans have not been saving, we had to borrow from abroad a very large proportion of this money. So this is the first war since the Revolutionary War where a substantial fraction of the cost has been paid for by foreigners. 40% of this money has been borrowed. Well, it's a more complicated story. All of these things have had a depressing effect on the economy. And one of the puzzles as we were writing the book was, why didn't the American economy seem weaker? Actually, it wasn't that deep of a puzzle because it was pretty clear. The Fed, recognizing these depressing effects, flooded the economy with liquidity, kept interest rates low, and the regulators, including the Fed, looked the other way with lax regulations as very bad mortgages and other kinds of loans that should not have been allowed were going on. So the result of this was that there was a housing bubble and a consumption boom in a period where young people were sacrificing their lives and risking their lives. Just to give you a little picture, over $1.5 trillion were taken out of American houses. Prices were going up, and they were called mortgage equity withdrawals, $1.5 trillion. Most of this was translated then into consumption. And so while the war was dragging the economy down, these mortgage equity withdrawals were pushing the economy up. But it was perfectly clear to at least a few of us that we were living on borrowed money and borrowed time. It was just a matter of time before a day of reckoning was going to come. We couldn't predict when it was. President Bush wanted it to happen after November 2008. But, you don't control timing, and he mismanaged a lot of things, and this is one maybe. And so beginning in August of this year, of 2007, things began to unravel, and they are unraveling very rapidly. The war means that we can't respond to the economic downturn in the way that we should. We had a recession in 2001. As we went into that recession, we were sitting on huge surpluses that had been built up during the Clinton administration. And that meant we had room for maneuver. As Bernanke has pointed out, we don't have room for maneuver now. We have a stimulus package, but it's too small, it's too late, and it's not well designed. Other than that, it's fine. And it is not going to be enough to stave off the economic downturn. There are two other things that, no, let me stop here. Let me just say that the two other things that what we talk about in the book. First, a set of recommendations. We want to be forward-looking, saying, okay, we've made mistakes. Where do we go from here? And we have a whole set of recommendations that try both, most importantly, on how we treat the veterans, but also on how we go budgeting, transparency, to make this kind of thing less likely to happen in the future. An analysis, a question of how this kind of analysis affects how we think about our exit strategy. Is it worth spending another $1.2 trillion to stay another 4 years? What do we buy? And that's the way of framing it. Is things going to be that much better 4 years from now to be worth spending $1 trillion? Is this the best way of increasing security? And the other point that we spend some time talking about is $3 trillion is a lot of money. So much money that it's hard for most people to wrap their heads around what it means. And what we try to do is to explain what it is. And I jokingly say, we've gotten a new unit of account. We can talk about, for instance, the president a couple years ago said, we have a fundamental problem with our Social Security system. It's going bankrupt. You young people are not going to be able to get your benefits. Well, for 1/6 of an Iraq war, you could have put the Social Security system on sound footing for the next 50 to 75 years. Or another one is the CDC has talked about real problems, the epidemic in autism. 1 out of 150 kids are being born, children are being born. We're spending a little over $100 million on research. That is roughly 4 hours of the Iraq War. And that's only the upfront cost of the Iraq War. So these are some of the ways of beginning to think about it. We're talking about minutes, hours, days of fighting that if we change that, we would have available for doing so many of the other things that are confronting challenges confronting our country. We wanted to hear from you and get some questions. And we want to say one thing that some of the most difficult issues are the war has opened up. There are some really new health issues like traumatic brain injuries that have really not occurred and are not well understood and are likely to be I say new research opportunities going forward are part of the tragic parts of this war.